All right. So we get started, Beth. You ready?
Yes, I am.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. Again, my name is Terrence Herwood, and I will be one of your hosts for this evening's webinar. Super excited to be here once again. Just to reintroduce myself, again, my name is Terrence Herwood. I'm actually an associate professor of multicultural education, social foundations at the University of Indianapolis. So my work for the last 25 years or so has been really working with future teachers and future school leaders to help them to develop the capacity to navigate cultural differences and similarities. And one of my major focuses is to really help them to deconstruct racial ideologies, class ideologies, ideologies around homophobia or difference in general. I start my courses pretty much by asking my students to think about one quick question. Who do you think you are? Who do you really think you are? And how could you be wrong about that? So the whole semester is designed to have students kind of processing, thinking about that. I really do believe that college is a really important formative time for people in their lives. And so my work has been about trying to get these folks before they get into the marketplace, before they get into the workforce, so that they can develop these capacities to be able to bring about structural changes like equity, et cetera, in the marketplace. So I've been super passionate, super grateful to be able to use the IDI ever since 2006. I do pre-test, post-test with my students. I use the content, the profiles to design my content, trying to figure out how to structure content and experiences in a way that's most palatable, as well as challenging and supportive of students and the classes based on where they are developmentally. So I'm really excited to share with you this evening. I'm going to go ahead and have my partner just share her introduction, and then I want to engage you guys for just 1 second before we jump into the content. Okay?
Oh, Terrence, so good to be back here with you and with the over 500 people who already signed on for our webinar tonight. Thank you all for joining us, particularly in this moment in our nation's history, to be able to talk about these issues and how to really think about the IDI and racial justice and intercultural competency as a resource to move towards racial justice. So a little bit about me. We introduced ourselves last time, but we also know there are some people who couldn't make it last time who are on tonight. So we want to welcome you as well. My name is Beth Zemsky. I am a full-time consultant, which means, as a colleague of mine says, I don't have a job and I work all the time, particularly these days. I've been a full-time consultant, and the work I do, I call intercultural organizational development. So I use the intercultural development continuum and the IDI with nonprofits, foundations, healthcare organizations, higher ed, K-12, everybody except corporations, actually, faith-based organizations. And the work I do is to try to embed intercultural competency and equity into everything the organization does, to close that gap between people's strategic vision about equity and their organizational development and systems development. My background in training, I was originally a psychotherapist, so psychobabble occasionally sneaks in. And I've spent over 30 years as a grassroots organizer and activist. My movement home has been the progressive wing of the LGBTQ movement, particularly around the intersections of sexuality, race, class, gender, immigration, and gender identity. So you'll hear more about that as we go along. So a couple of things that I just want to set tonight. First is a logistics thing. For those of you who were with us last time, IDI LLC has put up the recording of our last session on the QA resource page along with closed captions. So if you're somebody who needs that, or you know somebody who could not attend last time because it was not captioned in real time, that resource is available now about our last session. And the replay of this session, closed caption, will be available sometime next week. Ryan will put in the chat box an email of support@idi.com. We know that there's not a chat function in this webinar. Partly it's because there are so many of you and we wouldn't be able to attend to chat, but IDI LLC welcomes your questions, your feedback, and that email will be in the chat box for you to follow up with questions that will indeed be responded to. In addition, one other logistics thing, as part of our last session, you all received a resource guide with some tips for you, some resources there will be such a resource guide following this session, which will be available in the next few days, also sent out to folks and available on the IDI resource page. So that's my logistics. The other things I just want to say in terms of contexting are a couple of things about tonight. We want to be clear that of situating our discussion tonight of the development orientations of denial and polarization, utilizing the IDC as a tool to support development towards racial justice. So that's the framework in which we're going to be talking tonight. We want to be transparent about that. Because this session is tailored for people who are qualified administrators. So we are assuming some knowledge of the IDI and the intercultural development continuum. And we also want to recognize that as QAs, as qualified administrators of the IDI, we wear several hats. And the conversations and the stories and the suggestions we are going to share tonight are not just in the context of doing an individual IDI debrief, but we often get questions about how do you use the IDC in a group setting or in a way to make social change? How do we use the IDI results in that way, not just in the individual debrief, but also to some degree as a theory of change? So we're going to be focusing on thinking about the IDC to support individual systems and social change towards racial equity. So if we can think about having hat head in a way and put on multiple hats as we think about the IDC tonight, I think that will help our context. Back to you, my partner, Terrence.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Beth. And you know, I think a very fitting place to start this evening is to acknowledge the reality that many of you on the line tonight are likely hurting as a result of the traumatic events that happened in Kenosha, Wisconsin over the last couple of days. So we just want to hold space right now for that to, just to acknowledge that we know that you're present, but some of you may be still struggling with that issue. We get it. We definitely empathize. We're feeling the same things too from the IDI LLC perspective. And we want to offer this conversation as a way to support you as you are really trying to address and to engage with others who are similarly experiencing some trauma as a result of what has happened, what has been happening, and what continues to happen. So I just wanted to make sure that we began by just sharing that before we jump into the content tonight. All right, so last week, we started, for those of you who weren't with us, by just providing a broad overview, looking at the IDI as a tool for racial justice. Tonight, we're going to be addressing racial justice from the monocultural mindsets of denial and polarization, right? So specific objectives for tonight, we're going to discuss how denial and both the polarization, versions of the polarization, might be experienced by individuals whose worldviews are shaped through their identity, specifically whether or not they're dominant or non-dominant ideologies or identities, I should say. We're also going to elaborate on how the first two developmental stages might be explored from a racial justice perspective. We're going to put some examples here up for you. We're going to share some things that we've experienced either in our work or through some things that we've heard along the way. And then in the end, we want to provide some actionable tips on how to engage and how to have some conversations across these two developmental mindsets. In particular, we're going to spend a lot more time on polarization. What has happened in Wisconsin, folks, what's happened, all over, right, this country, in Minnesota, in Atlanta, all over Kentucky, has really heightened the polarization, amplified the polarization that has been happening in our society. We also know that COVID-19 really highlighted some of those dynamics as well. And we have also an election that's forthcoming that is likely to evoke a lot of polarization, and folks are going to have some conversations that they're going to have to navigate. We strongly believe that the IDI provides a tool to support people in navigating and promoting a form of healing that will be necessary, not only now, but also in the coming months and the coming years to come. So I wanted to offer that. Beth, anything you want to add to that before we jump into the specific content for tonight?
Yeah, so I want to jump back into this thing about having the dual pandemics, if you will, about racism. But before we do that, Terrence, can you just go back to the previous slide for a moment? So Terrence, I've got a question that somebody actually asked me yesterday. So if we look at the objective number one, the language we use is dominant and non-dominant. And in this moment of polarization, and that language is all over how we talk about the IDI and multiple identities and intersectionality. Can you just say a little bit, Terrence, from your perspective, how come that language? What does it mean from our perspective? And what might be the issues or problematics about that, if anything?
Yeah, I appreciate that question a lot, Beth, because it is a question that I've also I've gotten before. And one, I can see how people might struggle with the term dominant versus non-dominant, because it kind of evokes, in a sense, that there's one culture or one aspect of the culture that's just dominating the other one, and that the other one is voiceless, powerless, etc. Right? And that really is not the way how this term is meant and is used within the context of the IDI LLC. So when we talk about dominant or dominant culture, especially in terms of the US, what we're really meaning here is a group that tends to wield the most power. This could be political, this could be social, this could be economic power. And because of the power that they wield, they tend to legitimate and delegitimate which practices are deemed appropriate, acceptable, important, etc., and tends to, you know, delegitimate the perspectives, the practices of other groups. So when we use it, we're talking here within the context of the US, we're talking about white Protestant middle class, people from Northern European descent, which tend to, again, based on the way how our current society is structured, tends to wield more power and more influence. So I would say that, so when the IDI uses that in the profile or in the IDPs, that's exactly what they're being. Right? And from a racial justice perspective, we can, in the context of this conversation, replace it with a term like, you know, white supremacy. Right. But because the IDI transcends to more than just race, the term US dominant culture or versus non-dominant culture tends to be a more inclusive term. You can use it, I think, both of these terms to get at the same idea of white supremacy, or it could be, the issue could be in terms of like heteronormativism or, you know, classism. You can use it pretty similarly. Any thoughts on that, Beth? Or
no, I appreciate it. I just want the folks to know that one of the things we decided to do was ask each other some of the questions that you might be holding. And I completely agree with you. And it's useful when we talk about intersectionality, right? When we start thinking about sexual orientation or, you know, in my experience as a lesbian Jewish person, how do we even think about Christian hegemony and folks who are not Christian in what's a dominant Christian culture or a dominant heteronormative culture, as you said. And for tonight, we're really thinking about this in terms of white dominant culture and white supremacy. So thanks for that. Now we can go on to where you wanted to go. I just don't want to lose the question. So as Terrence was saying, we're in a moment. We're in a moment that's not just a moment. It's we have dual pandemics at the moment of racism as a public health and social crisis that is not just a crisis in the moment, but it's amplified by the current pandemic of COVID, and that these things interrelate with each other in the current political climate. Terrence, next slide, please. One of the things to think about we're in a moment right now where things feel like they're in a crisis, even though we've had 400 years in the United States of systemic anti-Blackness and racism. The thing about when things feel like a crisis is what makes a crisis, and I use my former therapist hat here, is that our typical problem-solving mechanisms have been exhausted. The difference between a problem and a crisis is a problem is we have problem-solving mechanisms to resolve, and a crisis, either the magnitude of the experience or it's a novel experience, has exhausted our current problem-solving mechanism. That's what makes it a crisis. And in the moment of crisis, we have the danger of either retrenching in just the way we do things around here. In this case, that could be white dominant or white supremacist culture, or the opportunity to really think, because all our systems are already disrupted by COVID, by the way we're living, by the way we're working, that this is actually an opportunity to do things differently. if we go to the next slide. So one of my colleagues, somebody named Stash Kohler, talked about this as a tsunami. Now, one of the reasons I like Stash's use of the metaphor of a tsunami is before the wave hits, and now we've been hit by a number of waves, the water recedes. And I think that's some of what, for those of us who have had the privilege of being on higher ground as the tsunami hits, some of what we've experienced where other folks have been living in this all the time. Terrence, next slide, please. So what we've seen a bit is the manifestations about how oppression and discrimination operate at a personal level, at a cultural level, at an institutional level, and at a structural level. And part of what we want to talk about tonight is developmentally, when might people be developmentally, if you will, prepared to engage with learning about each of these levels of oppression and discrimination. Terrence, next slide. So what happens when the water pulls back is before the wave hits us, we see what's exposed. We see the little fish grasping for breath. We see the things stuck in the muck. And I know it's not necessarily a great metaphor, but for those of us who have not been living, and I'm not going to make any assumptions about who's watching this webinar, but for those of us who've not been living the magnitude either of the healthcare disparities with COVID that are more impacting Black and brown communities, or the systemic racism that we're now experiencing and have been experiencing for generations on our street, what's happening for some folks is we're seeing the things that have been exposed that have always been there. And with that, Terrence, next slide. With that comes a certain level of trauma. So former therapist hat on. I just want to acknowledge trauma, because one of the things Terrence and I were talking about as we were preparing for this webinar is just what we've been noticing as we've been heading into fall with our client groups about the energy level, about how people are engaging. So Terrence, did you want to say anything about your observation, and then I can share mine?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the critical things that is coming to the forefront is how these events actually are impacting people, not just in terms of psychologically, but also impacting people in terms of, biologically, right? I think there's an acknowledgement of trauma that I'm hearing now that results from, racism and, systemic racism that I haven't fully heard this clear in the past. And I think it's also creating some very interesting tensions for some organizations, right? Some organizations, some of the leadership want to just jump right in and say, you know what? Before we can go any further, we need to acknowledge this. We need to address this level of trauma. And I think part of it is just some concerns by some other people. Well, if we just jump right into racism, this can cause other folks to become traumatized as well. So how do we kind of deal with that, right? The trauma that folks need to kind of release as a result of what's been happening, and the fear and the concerns and the discomfort that other groups who have not necessarily experienced this level of stress that shows up in bodies, that leads to sickness, that leads to early death. There's a lot of research around the impact that this can be having, and how do we really engage those dialogues in this intercultural space. I think is really important.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is as we've headed into fall, there's been so much energy, particularly here in Minneapolis where I live, around focusing on racial equity and doing the work. And as we head into fall, I'm really seeing a level of exhaustion that I've not seen before. So I just wanted to hold that as we're thinking about this tonight. And because I think to some degree, for some folks, just about the COVID part of this, we thought, oh, summer, by fall, we'll be back to normal. And I think we're now realizing this is the way things are going to be for a while. Added to that, the narrative of polarization that is widespread in the country as we heat up for the election, as Terrence said, and the ongoing polarization around the narratives about what's happening in the streets of our country. As we get into discussion about polarization and denial tonight, I just wanted to recognize the moment we're in that makes these conversations to some degree even more important to be thinking about in a holistic developmental context.
Absolutely, Beth. If I could just jump in just to add something here. Again, I think the whole idea of thinking about this from a long-term perspective is really important. As I started last week, a lot of folks are jumping in, they're sprinting, right? And they're not warming up, and that exhaustion that you just described is happening because they haven't necessarily developed the capacity yet for this. The other thing I would offer is, that, our dear friend and colleague Mary Frances Winters has just released a book called Black Fatigue that addresses a lot of these topics as well. I strongly recommend it. You can, of course, shameless plug on her behalf. You know,
so let me just add one other thing, because now you're speaking my geek language, and Terrence and I talked about me sharing this. I'm sort of a geek about social movement theory from my years of being an organizer. And one of the things I know about social movements and bringing change, social justice change to scale, is movements happen in 10 to 40-year arcs. That does not mean we're starting from scratch at the moment around the energy that we have around racial justice, but it does mean that these are really long-term projects. And we can talk my geekness some other time about that, but I hand it back to you to get into the next piece.
Ashley, you covered this one, but Beth and I will jump in. You want to talk about empathy a little bit? And then I will.
Sure. One of the things, back to my therapist hat, one of the things that I learned when I was working as a therapist is we used to define empathy as the ability to walk in somebody else's shoes. But what's real is I'm never going to be able to walk in Terrence's shoes, not as a Black man from Barbados with his experiences in the United States, besides the fact that his shoes going to be way too big for me. But does that mean that I cannot validate his experience as real and true for him? So I just want to offer this as we get into this conversation about denial and defense, polarization, reversal. It's also incumbent on us as QAs to think about, how do we validate somebody's experience as real and true for them, even if we find the content of their experience abhorrent to us? And how do we help them potentially empathize as they're developmentally able to experiences very different than their own, right? Without necessarily thinking about walking in somebody else's shoes. So we wanted to offer that. And we have a couple of ways that's going to play out as we talk about denial and polarization. Terrence?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the word empathy, Beth, is such an important one. And one of the things that you'll likely hear a lot, folks, is that there's an empathy deficit, right? When you look at the polarization that's happening in society, people are strongly arguing that this is happening because people are lacking the ability to empathize. It's a very interesting argument, but what the research just does show is that people are not necessarily becoming less empathetic. In fact, we are no less empathetic than we were in the 1970s or even before that. But what the research is showing essentially is that people are becoming empathetic, but only towards their own group. And so this whole idea of cross-cultural empathy requires a lot of intentionality, right? Because you know, for a lot of people, again, we are retrenching, as you mentioned before, into our own kind of tribes, and it makes it hard for people to kind of empathize. So let me just show a quick video, Beth, to kind of illustrate this point quickly, and then
it's a new study of the Yale Child Study Center that I had to read a few times just to believe what it was telling me. The researchers recruited about 135 preschool teachers. They had them watch video footage of 4 kids playing: a black boy, a black girl, a white boy, and a white girl. And they told the teachers, their subjects, watch the video, there may be some challenging behaviors. As soon as you see something that could become challenging, hit the enter key on your keypad. And here's the trick. There was no challenging behavior. The researchers were using eye-scan technology to see which child the teachers were looking at the most. And what they found is that the teachers, both white and black alike, spent the most time watching the black boy, waiting for bad behavior that never came. There's one more really interesting headline in this study, which comes later. The teachers were also given a 1-paragraph description to read of a hypothetical child with a stereotypical name who behaves pretty badly in class, pushes, scratches, throws toys. And some of the teachers were also given some biographical information that helped make sense of that behavior. They were told that the child lives with his mother, father has been in and out for years, they're relatively poor, the mother is depressed, works 3 jobs. Researchers wanted to know if knowing this information made the teachers more empathetic to the kid. Well, here's the shock. It did, but only if the teacher and the child were of the same race. If the teacher and the child, a white teacher and a black child, or even a black teacher and a white child, knowing that biographical information, those teachers were less empathetic towards those students. And here's why this matters. Imagine if this is true, if there's this empathy deficit in preschool, well, Imagine where else that's true.
I think that raises a very, very, very important question, right? This idea of empathy. And as QAs, as trainers, right, organizational developers, what can you do and how will you be able to facilitate this development of empathy so that folks can be able to connect with folks who are different from themselves, culturally, racially, et cetera. A very important, I think, skill set. And I think what the IDI theory suggests is that the more developed you are along the continuum, the more likely you are to be more empathetic cross-culturally. So that's what we're hoping to be able to generate with our clients. So we're gonna jump into the developmental continuum here, folks. We're gonna start with the monocultural mindset of denial. As you see here, not a whole lot of people score in this particular developmental stage. So we're gonna spend a little time here talking about this and how it may show up from a dominant versus non-dominant perspective. And then we're gonna jump right into polarization, as you see there, because we got about 15.5% of people scoring at polarization. So let's jump right in here. I'm gonna begin with this image here. We wanna credit, first of all, this to our colleague, Mr. Newa. And so if you look at this image, hopefully you can see this okay. We wanna introduce you to our fictional friend here, Sam. Sam walks into this restaurant, and as you can see the audience, we just have pigs and chickens. And Sam, totally oblivious to his environment, right? Totally blinded by his surroundings, not necessarily paying any attention to the context, just decides to order ham and eggs, right? So ordinarily, of course, ordering ham and eggs is just normal, right? There's nothing wrong with that ordinarily. But in this situation, if Sam was trying to, let's say, recruit people to join his college or to be part of his institution, his behavior, the fact that he is not thinking about the context would likely, impact him and impact his ability to be successful. So understanding the context, really trying to make sense of and being attentive to, the context, the surroundings, is a very important skill set that may be missing from the very first developmental mindset. Beth, did you want to add anything about on that before we jump in?
No, the only thing I would add is I love this cartoon, and Newa Abdulwahid has been sort of the source of a lot of these Far Side cartoons. I don't know what he does with the rest of his time other than find Far Side cartoons. But I've shown this to a ton of people, and somebody in one workshop said, "Why are ham and eggs even on the menu?" And somebody else said, "Maybe they're not on the menu, but he's so used to the world being the way it is for him, he walks through the world and expects it to show up that way." And there's a lot of ways of defining the word privilege, and I think that's a great definition of the word privilege. The privilege to be sort of indifferent to context, not really see context, kind of be oblivious about context, and to kind of walk through the world as if it was the way you expected it to be. There's other definitions of privilege at different developmental orientations, but I thought that was a pretty good one that was offered by a participant.
Yeah, I like that a lot as well. So as you mentioned, Beth, denial, some of the characteristics here, they're very comfortable with the familiar, right? Because the individuals here are likely haven't had a lot of exposure. Let me go back just a couple of slides to kind of indicate this for a second. And I got this from Mary Frances Winters, again, her idea of a 4E model. And she suggests that developing intercultural competence, first of all, requires a certain level of exposure to cultural differences, right? You have to be exposed. You have to be somehow connect with people who are culturally different from yourself. But exposure, it takes more than that, right? So mere just exposure or proximity is not sufficient. You have to be able to experience cultural differences, the second year experience. And we know like a lot of people may even live in certain communities, or may even travel abroad, but never have experience from the perspective of others. The third one is education. What are you doing to develop knowledge, skill set, different frameworks, different ways of thinking about cultural differences and similarities and how to operate and how to navigate them? And these three things allows people to develop this emotional empathy. We were just talking about empathy, Beth, a second ago, the emotional empathy. So I might not necessarily be able to walk in your shoes and experience it the same way, but I might have had some type of experience where I had these emotional responses, and you had grief, I had grief, and maybe if we can connect on that emotional level, I don't get the circumstances, but I can feel what it might feel like to have that emotion, and that is a way of connecting people as well. So They're comfortable, again, back to denial, very comfortable, seek out the familiar, again, likely haven't had a lot of exposure, education, experience. And so the belief here is then my culture is the only reality. Because of this, they may have this benign intent and neglect and may use stereotypes, not because they are, they're trying to harm or trying to be malicious, but likely because they haven't had any experience or exposure. They may say some things, do some things that may be problematic, may be offensive, etc. Right? So the emotion here, the primary emotion for a person at denial is indifference. I don't know, and I don't really care to know. So I want to stop here though, Beth, a second, just to kind of caution some people, because for QAs, my experience is a lot of times when people see denial and see the scores being, to the left of the continuum, many QAs oftentimes have judgment, right? Many people, if I have worked with some QAs, and when they saw a denial profile, they say stuff like, "Oh, good God, you take it," right? And so my experience is I love denial. Right? Denial is actually my favorite profile. When I see a denial profile and when I'm engaging with a person who scores with a denial, my sense is that, when they show up, that this is likely to be one of the first substantive experiences that they've had navigating cultural differences and similarities. And so they're usually, again, in my perspective, this is new. This is a different way to think about and experience the world. And many of them are actually open to the possibility that, oh, well, maybe my traditional experience here, is not the only way to see the world. So I just wanted to add that before we go into denial. But I want to show a quick video here, just a couple of seconds, to show how denial may interface with content and dialogues about race. This comes from the video, The Color of Fear. This is just, again, a short clip to just kind of engage you, to have you think about what denial might look like as you're navigating conversations about race.
I'm a local boy, grown, raised right here in this small community. And when the subject of racism was mentioned to me, I found it extremely exciting because I grew up in this area with friends of all races. And we would read in the news, see on the television of racial struggles in other areas and could not comprehend how that could be, why they had to cause struggle and strife for each other. Why couldn't they be just like at home, happy and productive together? And I don't think that anybody should be any less than another. I grew up in this area right alongside the Native Americans. And some of them to this day are my dearest friends. And I like their cultures, yes. And I even seek after artifacts from their history, but there's no struggle or strife if you don't cause it.
So here is a very interesting dynamic, right? Because what's happening here is, we talked about not necessarily having a lot of exposure, but here this gentleman is claiming that he's had a lot of exposure. He's been proximate, right, to people who are culturally different. If you notice some of the things that he was discussing, right, the stuff that he valued or the way how he engaged, he's collecting artifacts, right? He's not necessarily engaging in the subjective, we talked about the objective versus the subjective culture, the real meaning-making system. So consequently, it seems to be bewildering to him. It seems like too complicated for him to hold a perspective to think about racism can exist outside of the individual experience, right? So denial has to do, again, how do we make sense of difference? So exposure alone, marked by by just naive experiences, does not necessarily promote any type of sophistication around this issue. All right. So Beth, you want to jump in here and share?
So one thing I just want to say is, as we were watching this, those of us who are facilitators are probably seeing everybody in the room react. And so I want to just ask you to hold that, because later on, we're going to talk about what do you do when all this stuff is going on in a room together. So I do want to just note that we're going to get there. So supporting developmental shifts at denial is really about increasing the awareness of visible cultural additions and the ability to notice, right? So if you go back to the 4E model, it's how do folks experience their experience in a more complicated way of noticing cultural differences, as well as really about seeing other people's cultures as every bit as rich as their own, which is really the developmental question. Terrence? Do you want to talk about this, Terrence? Or you want me to keep going?
Yeah, you go ahead. You keep going.
Okay, so working with a group in denial, which frankly, I've only seen one in all my years, and I won't say who, but I've only seen one group in denial. And organizations in denial, groups in denial, there are usually issues of diversity and inclusion are ignored and really focus on fixed answers, one size fits all. And so when we try to sort of say, well, maybe that doesn't work, it's really beginning to help them understand where their own ideas of one size fits all comes from, right? And helping to see that other people's cultural answers may be as every rich as their own. The challenge is that because of how power operates, is if they're an organization with resources and power in a community, the one size fits all could really increase the possibility of exploitation. Everybody talks about best practices. And my experience is that organizations in denial, the one I work with, the perception of best practice is often, this is the traditions, we've always done it, there's no problem with it, etc. And I want to let you know that my name's on the bottom of the slide, but some of this stuff came from some of the original work that Milton Bennett did around how power shows up in the developmental model. So I want to just reference that. Shall we keep going, Terrence?
Yes.
Back to you.
Yeah, so again, it's not very common to see denial showing up amongst people who are part of, who recognize or who identify as non-dominant, right? And again, we're saying that the term dominant versus non-dominant, but as QAs, we don't get to define who is dominant versus non-dominant. So the individuals get to say, you know, for themselves, hey, I identify as a dominant or non-dominant, because we don't know all of their identities. They may be more attending to an identity that's not visible, that again, that we don't have access to. So, but it is unusual, though not like unlikely, right? It is still possible that you might find it, but not very common to find individuals from historically marginalized backgrounds or non-dominant identities in denial. If it does happen, it may reflect, and again, I'm just going to draw really quickly from another developmental model, right? But it could be connected to some type of early stages of racial identity development, right? I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but you might hear a statement like, you know what, I'd rather be just seen as just a human, not by my race. So a sense of, you know, I want to operate not as a racialized person. I just want to be seen as a human. I just want to be seen as a person. I just want to be seen as American. Don't see me in terms of a race. It was often, so another quote here is, you know, why do we keep blaming white people for slavery? It was actually other Africans who were responsible for slavery. You know, it was these chiefs who actually, you know, who robbed or who stole other enslaved African people and sold them to, you know, to the white man. So all of this stuff you might hear that may be indicative of a person who is, again, at an early developmental stage. But I want to mention and caution you again that as QAs, it is not our responsibility to try to diagnose or try to place or situate anyone along the developmental continuum. Let the tool do the job for you. So I know that in showing that video and kind of talking about it here, we might be, you know, it might be at risk for people thinking, oh, so when we hear these statements, yes, this person is definitely, no, you never know. It's a much more complex issue than we ourselves are able to do. So let the tool speak for us. So Beth, you want to talk about, let's do some story time here and talk about like.
Yeah, you know, we're just going to tell short stories because we want to make sure we get to polarization in the 20 minutes remaining to us. So two very short things. One is it's a chancy business, just picking up on what Terrence's saying, to predict what developmental stages somebody could be in. Short story. I'm going to call Tim. Tim, a white working class guy, grew up on a ranch farm in South Dakota. His closest neighbor was 5 miles away. He had almost no exposure, very little experience. I came into contact with Tim because he was a manager supervisor in facilities management at the university, meaning he was a custodial supervisor. And he was recommended to this leadership program because he was the guy who figured out how to work with his crew, were all Somali women, And he figured out how to adapt all of the cleaning protocol, all of the machines, all the chemicals, so they could come to work with their hijab, pray when they needed to pray. And when we did his IDI, he was an adaptation. But if you would have looked at his background, you would have thought this guy would have been in denial. So again, it's about how you experience your experience, not the level of experience that you have. The other thing that I'll say is one of the few times I worked with somebody with what we would call a non-dominant culture identity, of somebody with a denial orientation. It was a brand new graduate student who was from Seoul, and she had just arrived in the United States. Her DO was in denial as an orientation because she came from this incredibly homogeneous culture and didn't quite understand how suddenly she was a person of color in the United States. And it was very disruptive to her way. She was very curious about it, but it led to a lot of questions for her around what she was how she was going to experience the complexity of other people's culture and her own culture. So I would just add that to the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Beth. And I think what you said there about like not necessarily like judging people based on where they come from, that's important, because I think in every state, there's this one town or there's this one community that has this reputation, right? And sometimes we judge, and when we hear some person is coming from a particular place, something comes up for us around, right? We tend to form judgments around, this person being racist or sexist or whatever else, but based on where they're from. I think the story that I would add here is from one of my students. Again, she also scored in denial, but she also found topics around race to be very, very challenging. In fact, one day in class, she bursted out by saying, why do we always have to talk about race? When I think about race, to me, I think about like a sore, a person having like this sore. And I feel like talking about race is like you keep picking and picking and picking and picking at it. If you keep picking at it, it will never get a chance to heal. So maybe if we want to end racism, the best thing to do is to just stop talking about race all the way. So I thought that was a very interesting conversation. And so at another time, we could talk about how I responded to that. But let's get right into the next developmental stage here.
I'm sure everybody's like, what did you do with that, Terrence? If you have one sentence, because we're going to run out of time. One sentence,
Absolutely.
What did you do with it?
So, I felt like it was important to kind of match her metaphor. And so I offered her to perhaps consider that sore that she was talking about was also on the inside, causing some gangrene, right? And unless you go and do the hard work to kind of excavate, that pus, it might cause the person to lose the arm. So sometimes doing the hard work is like really important, right? And I think staying with that metaphor and the gruesomeness that she had attached to it, I think was able to help her to start thinking about, maybe there's another way to think about this as opposed to the way I'm thinking about it. All right.
And I think that's key to all the developmental work, is how do we meet somebody where they're at and bring them along, right? So let's go on and we'll do it. And just because this is a 3-part series, I want to say to folks, if we don't get to everything tonight, because both of us love talking about this stuff, we will pick up whatever we don't get to tonight next time. Okay, so we will keep morphing as we go through. Let's keep going, Terrence. I think it's my turn, right? So I want to talk about polarization, and polarization could be captured by this one sentence. We know it's much more complex than that, but if we needed a summary, some cultures and points of view are obviously more right than others. If you deny that, you're just being dishonest. So let's keep going. So next slide. So let's just go there. So the thing about polarization is that there's polarization defense and reversal, as we know as QAs. So polarization defense is really this us and them. And as we talked about earlier, this is kind of a dominant narrative, but we have to remember that it's less than 20% of folks. This is the predominant orientation. It does not mean when we don't experience trauma that some unresolved kind of stuff from previous development orientations might not come up, but it's not people's, for the majority, are not here as their primary orientation, even though it feels like we're surrounded by it. I just think it's one of the ways to think about the IDC as a tool for us, if nothing else, to calm our own nervous systems, right? So polarization, as you know, is about us and them. It's about stereotyping those people. We are better than them. They are better than us. One of the things about polarization as a primary mindset is that folks in polarization tend to have, as a primary orientation, a strong commitment to their own worldview. They can see difference, but they distrust difference or different ideas. As a result, there tends to be an overemphasis on difference and not as much competency to find or acknowledge commonalities. What often happens when folks are in the primary orientation of defense is what we often see is anger. What is underneath anger is fear. And it's most often fear of a threat to belief or a way of life. It's folks feeling like they're in a stage of siege. So the reason I have this little picture here is that folks who have a primary orientation of polarization might not even see a ton of complexity of their own culture, but don't see almost any complexity about other people's realities, their lives, the struggles they face. And there's a sense of protection. So you can think about that circle as a moat, a fence, a wall, to protect us from them invading and destroying our way of life. Next slide, Terrence. So what happens in the mindset of defense is, for dominant culture folks, often a defense of privilege. I need to protect my way of life from being eroded from them. We already talked about some of these other stuff that's on the slide, like negative evaluation of difference, perception of threat. How sometimes this shows up is resistance to topics like integration, affirmative action. And you can see it being, without getting too political, you can see it play out in the narratives about the election. Your suburbs will be destroyed. Your streets will be taken over, right? Polarization narratives, because the polarization, folks who have a primary orientation polarization can see their way of life as superior, and fear it will be overrun by outsiders, right? Next slide, Terrence. So the way this, and I just want to say, this doesn't always show up for folks in dominant culture. It can also show up for folks in non-dominant culture. And I'll give you an example of this in a moment. But for folks in non-dominant culture, if I'm in an environment, let me try to explain it this way. If I'm in an environment of minimization, which is an overestimation of commonality, and I'm being told all the time, you're just like us, you're just like us, you're just like us, you're just like us. Or I'm in an environment in which my identity is being obliterated by the polarization of the dominant culture. How am I going to protect my own identity? So polarization for non-dominant culture can be really a defense of my identity. You are not eradicating my identity. You are not eradicating my community. You are not dismissing our experience. So it can be a real protection of identity from being diminished. It can also be an effort to reclaim a lost or newly discovered identity. I remember in the midst of, this is not my first pandemic, in the midst of the HIV pandemic, when thousands of LGBT, queer men who had sex with men were dying, and a lot of folks were just coming out and a new identity into this highly polarized, highly scary environment. There was Queer Nation, there were Queers Bash Back. An attempt to sort of say, no, we can form an identity in opposition to the attempts for our lives not to matter or for our community to be obliterated. So it can also be a strategic way to defend a group from annihilation and fear and threat. So when we're working with groups who might have a polarization orientation, diversity included is often seen as problems and obstacles. And sometimes what we see is same culture segregation. And there's lots of reasons for that. And sometimes it's about protection, and sometimes it's about, white pride or white supremacy, if you will. What tends to happen in organizations or systems, as we're now seeing in the United States, is policy and practice retrenchment. So discussion about policies, it's only benefiting those people. And sometimes there's sort of a blaming the victim piece that happens around this. So let me just suggest to us as QAs, using the developmental model, what does not work with folks who might have a developmental orientation of polarization defense. So for those of us who are not in this mindset, one of the things we might do as an attempt to increase empathy around racial disparities, racial injustice, is share a ton of data. Let me just tell you what you got wrong. Let me tell you what the data says. Let me just tell you, let me write another white paper or something like that, right? My experience is it doesn't work that well with Uncle Harry of Thanksgiving, and it doesn't necessarily work well as an effective intervention to move people out of a defense mindset. And part of that is for two reasons. Remember, folks with a primary orientation in defense have a strong commitment to their own worldview. So when I try to share data, what happens sometimes is confirmation bias. I'm going to pick out of that piece of data what already fits my pre-existing mindset because I know what's right. And you're trying to give me data that I don't believe. I can see difference and I distrust what you're trying to say. So it's just not an effective strategy. The other thing that there's now some new research on is called backfire effect. You try to tell me I got it wrong, which just increases my sense of difference and increases my sense of protection. And so it backfires and I double down on my pre-existing worldview. I don't have a lot of data for this next statement I'm about to make, but let me just say from my analysis, this is the fake news phenomenon. Right? I'm going to call what you say fake news from my mindset of polarization because I can see difference. I don't trust difference. You're trying to dissuade me that I'm wrong, and I'm going to protect my way of life, my thought system, my belief system. So what are we supposed to do if it's not, let me tell you what you got wrong, and here's the data, which frankly, sometimes if we're deeply invested, in, as I am, in critical race theory and in documenting the disparities as a way to deal with racism, that might be what works for me. And so one of the things for us to do as change agents is to think about what works for me is around maybe my development orientation, or might even be my perceived orientation. Is that really what is going to work? Is what I mean by work, I mean being effective to support somebody else's development. Because my job is not always to feel like I'm right. It's to be effective in supporting somebody else's development. So Terrence, can we go to the next slide? So when organizations or folks are in defense, power can be used to really oppose racial justice. And as I said, blame the victim. So what do we do if we're not supposed to tell them we've got wrong? Potentially, it's help people find commonalities where they think none exist. I was listening to a podcast recently with Alan Alda, you know, the guy from MASH, and he's doing a ton of work with folks who are climate deniers. And one of the things he said that fits so well in here is rather than trying to convince people what they got wrong, can we be curious first about what matters to them? Why is something important to them? And then find commonality around that. And I want to just mention two things. One is Habitat for Humanity Twin Cities was a client of mine, and this is an intentional strategy. I used to think that they did volunteer labor because it was cheaper. It's not actually because they have volunteer coordinators, all kinds of things. But they started doing the strategy of let's put up plywood together, partly because of not in my backyard, NIMBY. And so the idea was to bring people together across differences and have them do something together. The other thing that I will just suggest as a resource, a sort of colleague acquaintance of mine named Sally Kohn, K-O-H-N, wrote a book called The Opposite of Fear. And her premise is the opposite. By the way, she was a Fox and CNN commentator. Long story as an out lesbian Jewish person, how she got to Fox. But she wrote this book, and what she basically said was the opposite of fear is not love, it's connection. And if we think about a lot of what's motivating some of what's happening in defense is that kind of fear. The key developmental question is, how can I find anything in common with me and them? Because the idea is to move people developmentally to minimization. And the strength of minimization is, how do I find the core humanity of this person? And if I can't see you as human, if I only can see the difference, then that is a very hard developmental thing to do. Often what we try to do with folks in defense is try to get them to be empathetic of experience other than their own, try to give them information about people other than their own. And unfortunately, all that does is increase the sense of difference. And what we need to do is help folks find a sense of commonality. So that was a lot. We're going to start running short of time, but I wanted to dig deeper into defense given what's going on, rather than move through it super quickly.
Absolutely. That's so helpful. There's so many things that you said there that just got my head kind of percolating that, I'm going to just jump off script for a couple of minutes here. I know we only got like 3 minutes left, but this would likely mean that we'll have to spend some time perhaps in the next webinar really addressing the idea of, reverse polarization, which
Yes.
is a very, very, very important thing that's happening now, right? Because folks are jumping again into this without warming up. And you see a lot of judgment towards members of their own group, members of their own families. Families are polarized. So we've got a lot to talk about that definitely 3 minutes is not going to cover. But one of the things that you talked about there is a commitment to your own culture that I think is very, very valuable. And to also encourage folks to think that any value that's taken to the extreme can be potentially problematic, right? So I've got this commitment over here. And if I'm really super committed, I think that might inhibit my ability to be open to other possibilities. I'm committed, so committed to this being the only way, this being the best way of doing it. When you offer me, another possibility, I'm going to reject it. And so I think one of the things that they're kind of sinking their feet up and really resisting is the idea of being open, because if you can take openness to the other extreme, and if I'm just super open, it might come across as though like, maybe you don't have a moral base. Maybe there's nothing there that you just, anything goes for you, and I can't see myself being you. So I feel threatened by you. I feel threatened by this difference that you kind of present to me. So it's like, how do you want to jump in?
Because I want to share the story that we had talked about,
okay,
which I think is exactly your point. Is that okay? In 1 second, in 1 minute, I want to share this little story. And then next time we'll pick up reversal and some of the group strategies that we were going to talk about today. So I did an IDI with a rabbi, and he was part of an interfaith group working on racial justice. And he was down with the work, completely committed. And his IDI was, his PO was in high acceptance, and his DO was in polarization defense. And we had the conversation, and I explained to him, and I said, what we went through, and I asked him, what this meant to him. And he said, of course, my identity is in polarization defense. My job is to protect the Jewish people from annihilation. And then we had the conversation that you're talking about, Terrence, about, yes, his job is to protect identity, but is that actually serving him in terms of his goals towards doing racial equity? Because in that, he was to some degree a bit hypervigilance around protecting his own identity that was actually getting in his way of forming authentic relationships across race. So we're at about time.
Yes.
And I just wanted to make it real with a story. And we always have so much to talk about. And I hope we whet people's appetites for digging into reversal and group strategies and minimization next time. And with that, I'm going to stop.
So Beth, thank you so much. I had fun again, dialoguing, playing with you. We have so much more to talk about. Can't wait, folks, to the next webinar. We're going to talk about reversal, then we're going to jump into minimization, which is one of the most challenging of the developmental stages, right? And we have a resource there that gets more into dominant versus non-dominant groups and how they might be experiencing polarization. So folks, thank you again for coming, to spending this portion of your evening with us. We had fun. So we'll talk to you folks in a couple of weeks. I believe the next one is on September the 8th. Is that correct, Beth? September the 8th is the next one.
Let me just look, make sure. It is actually, I have it on September 10th. So we'll make sure that everybody gets the right info.
Okay, we'll make sure that you get the right information, the 8th or the 10th. Let's leave it at that. So folks, thank you. Take care, take charge, and have a good evening.
Thank you, everybody.